everyone. My name is Anna Mwaba, and I'm an assistant professor of government at Smith College. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this panel on public confidence and polarization. Just to let you know, this session is being recorded. We will stop recording at the Q&A session. We have 4 interesting and very timely papers today. Each presenter will be allocated 10 to 15 minutes, and I'll give a reminder in the chat and also verbally at around 3 minutes. After the presentations, our discussant Aleena will share her comments on the papers, and then we'll allocate time for questions. You may share your questions in the chat, or if you feel comfortable, you may raise your hand during the Q&A, and if time allowing, we'll do our best to get to you. So without further ado, we'll follow the order on the program. And our first paper is by Matteo Ferroni, and it's entitled Election Results and Democratic Discontent, Expectations, Extremism, and Democratic Values in Post-Election Brazil. So please, Matteo.
All right, thank you so much for having me here. Since it's a short presentation, I will just jump into it. So we are all familiar with this picture, right? January 6, 2021. And the interesting thing is that very similar things happen also in Brazil 2 years and 2 days after. This was like January 8, 2023. So this is a trend that has been happening in different democracies all around the world in recent years. So one question we could ask ourselves is like, we have seen this increase in post-election violence. Why did we observe this, right? So this is what I try to do in this paper. So that more generally, like the research question is, what makes people more violent and anti-democratic after losing an election, okay? So in particular, as I was mentioning, I studied the 2022 presidential election in Brazil, which is the 4th largest democracy in the world. So it makes sense also to not just focus in the US. The method that I use here is like to collect, I collected 5 different waves of online surveys at various moments in the election period. I will show you more the details, but just so you know, Brazil is like a 2-round electoral system. So like the election took like more than 1 month. So I've been serving people all around that period. And the strength of my project here is like that I managed to recontact the same respondent right before and right after the election results. So really see what changed in their mind and opinion when they learned who was the winner of the election. So in these surveys, I asked questions about their expectation, both about who was going to win the election, but also expectation of how the economy is going to do, like the inflation rate, these kind of things. And also more general attitudes and belief, both about democracy or like towards violence. So this is the first study to exploit within individual variation in this context, right? There are a lot of papers that look at the effect of electoral result, but none of them actually look into the same individual. In this paper, I will be a bit short on this part, but I also built a model to try to show how extremism and expectation actually lead people to become more violent. And as I was saying, I look at the election effects on violent anti-democratic sentiments. And moreover, to better identify this channel, I also conducted an online survey experiment to provide an alternative identification to my results. So to briefly give you a context of the election, the 2022 election in Brazil was between Lula and Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was the incumbent. He's been in charge for 4 years. Lula was the president from 2003 to 2011. It was very, people approve a lot of him because it was where the economy of Brazil were expanding, while Bolsonaro was leading in power, more following like a populist movement. The campaign was very violent and polarizing, so very similar to the 2016 campaign in the US or the 2020, where we see here some headlines about violence. There was already Bolsonaro will start claiming that if he will lose the election, it was only because there have been fraud, he will for sure win. Even some people killing each other before the election. So very polarizing, with a lot of fake news around, very similar to the 2020 election in the US, to just have a comparison. This was the final result in the second round. So Lula was elected president, who is the current president of Brazil. And this was like the closest election ever in Brazil history. So this gap was very small. So just to confirm that it was something, it was not like the polls were saying that it was close and then it wasn't. It was really something that split the country in two. And until the last moment, it was not sure who was going to win. Okay, so what I did was, as I was mentioning before, I conducted an online survey using a survey company. The data set is representative of the adult Brazilian population along age, gender, income, and geographical areas. So in total, I have 6,200 respondents collected in 5 different waves. And the right contacts were like I managed to have a 60% recontact rate, which is quite high given this context. So I was not something in my control. So I was quite happy with these results. And instead, the survey experiment was conducted 1 year later, between September and October of 2023, with 3,000 respondents. So this is just to give you a better time frame of the data collection. As I was saying, like Brazil is a 2-round system. The first round was in October 2nd, the second October 30. Before the second round, I collected 2,000 observation, and here's like the recontact are like the 1,200 that I managed to survey before and after. So my main analysis focus on these 1,200 respondents, but I use also all the other observation to see the evolution, the trends more on a descriptive level. Okay, I will be very short on this just to give you the intuition that will help understand better the results. So the intuition of the model is like people have a choice of becoming violent and anti-democratic to try to change who's in charge of the government, right? And this will show you like that it explained by polarization and also the expectation after an election. And this adds a bit of a rational component to this decision, in the sense like it's easy to say these people are crazy, they just want to destroy things, but actually maybe there is some more rational explanation which could, of course, disagree with their behavior and decision, but at least like it's important to understand what's going on in their mind. So the intuition is quite simple. We have individuals whose utility depends on the country's economy. And I assume here that it depends mainly on the competence of the president, or at least it's what people think. And the idea is like if there is a better alternative available, they will pay the cost of becoming violent to try to change who's the president, right? They're saying, okay, the economy is so bad, now it makes sense for me to try to change who's in charge because the things are going to be better otherwise. Here, I want just to focus briefly on this component of my model, which is the expectation shock, which is something that I actually measure with my survey. So the idea here is like how your expectation about the economy generally changed right after the election result. And my model shows that actually this depends on the probability that you are assigning to, in this case, Bolsonaro winning, times the difference between the perceived competence of the two candidates. So the intuition is saying, if I think that Lula is much worse than Bolsonaro, this gap is going to be very large, and negative because you think Bolsonaro is much better. And if you were giving like a high expectation that Bolsonaro was going to win, like you were saying, he's going to win for sure, when he actually lost the election, this expectation shock is going to be negative and very large, right? On the other hand, if instead you are giving 0 probability to Bolsonaro winning, of course, you're not going to receive an expectation shock. If we add like, we can rank these things, this is a prediction of the model, depending of your extremism, how strong of a supporter you are. So as I was mentioning before, if you're like an extreme Bolsonaro supporter, saying that you're convinced 100% that he's going to win and you think that is the best while Lula is the worst, your expectation shock is going to be very negative. If you're more a moderate support, you're uncertain who's going to win, is going to be a bit like in the middle ground, but still negative. And then it's not clear how the Lula supporter expectation shock are going to rank among each other. And this is what I found with my observation data. It perfectly predicts what my model was saying, where we have like a more stronger Bolsonaro supporters experience a much more negative expectation shock, while the Lula supporters are close around 0 expectation shock. The prediction of my model is that the more negative the expectation shock, the more likely they are to switch from non-violence to violence. But that's not the only condition. They also need to be extreme enough, right? It's not like that you're a moderate supporter. Even if you're surprised, that's not enough. You need to be an extreme supporter and also experience a very negative shock. So this is just like the regression that I do, is like a triple interaction pre and post by kind of supporter you are. Like we have 40% of my sample consider themselves to be extreme supporters, and also interacted with this negative expectation shock. So the outcome variables that I look in my main analysis is like the belief that violence is acceptable to express disagreement with the government. So this is like an attitude towards violence. And also I ask questions about support for various political system, and here I'm interested in democracy or army rule. So this is the main result of my paper. And as you can see, when we interact like the different kind of supporters, of Bolsonaro supporters, with the expectation shock, as my model predicted, I find only significant effects on among the extreme Bolsonaro supporters. So we see that extreme Bolsonaro supporters that experience a large enough negative expectation shock, they become more likely to agree that violence is acceptable. They're less likely to think that democracy is a good political system for Brazil, and more likely to believe that army rule will be a good political system. So then the next important question is this a short-lived or persistent reaction? Because remember, like this data, I surveyed these people the day after, or maximum like 2 days after the election results. So maybe they were really mad about the election result, and so they answer in this way to the survey. So it's important to say, okay, but this is something that we need to be care about, or we can just leave them there for a few days and then everything goes back to normal. So what I look, so sadly, like I was not able to recontact the same individuals over and over. So if some of you work with survey data, that you know that it's hard to recontact the same people, especially after like weeks of months. So I focus on looking into persistence of the expectation, because again, the expectation was the trigger for this violence. So looking how persistent expectations are might be a first hint of whether this anti-democratic sentiment is also persistent. So what I find is that even after 1 year, Bolsonaro supporters still have a very low expectation about Brazil economy. So this is, as I was saying, a suggestion that if that's the trigger that leads to anti-democratic reaction, it will still be careful and concerned about these results. So this is like what the data looks like. So as you can see here, I'm around the second round. It's like the shock that I was talking about. It's interesting to see also how the two different kind of supporters were very aligned on their expectation. Because again, it's an average of people that were sure that their candidate was going to win, or those that were less sure. But you see that they were perfectly aligned on what they expected to be how the economy of Brazil was going to go. When Lula won, Lula supporters become more positive because, well, their candidate won, and as it should be, there should be more optimistic about that, while the expectation of Bolsonaro supporters dropped. So this is like a recontact that I did a few weeks after. So this was like mid-November, so like just a couple of weeks after. And here is like the recontact 1 year after, and you can see that it's completely flat. So their expectation about the economy is still exactly the same. So then in the paper, I also try to better test, because of course there's a lot of things going on at the same time. You might not trust the election result. You might be very polarized, or you might be like more.
All right, he's going to 3 minutes.
Yes, perfect. You might be very surprised. So there is a lot of things. It's hard to disentangle the two. In the paper, I also have some more robustness checks, but the idea will be here. Okay, let's check if expectation about the economy really matter for this anti-democratic sentiment, or if it was just like capturing something else, right? So what I did to try to have an alternative identification was to run a survey experiment where I randomly treat respondents with information on the economy. So the intuition was like, I give you positive information about the economy, your expectations are going to increase. So if this is actually a channel leading to your views towards democracy, your democratic discontent should decrease. So this is a survey, that an experiment that I did like around 1 year after the election result, 3,000 respondents, and to make sure like I still have a large share of Bolsonaro supporters, not that they magically disappear or they start like hiding who they voted for. Again, very evidence that it's a very polarized society. This was the treatment. Very simple. I was showing that the inflation rate during the last months of Bolsonaro presidency was quite flat, and after in the first months of Lula presidency, start dropping more. Now actually it bounced back, but again, it's real data. I was just wanted to give like this snapshot of a positive to try to make them more positive about their expectation. So this is like the first stage of the effects. So the first thing I want to see if their expectation about the economy actually change. And it's interesting to see that, okay, they believe the treatment, because they are more likely to say, okay, inflation actually decreased in 2023, which is actually what I'm showing in the graph, right? So they believe that. And also Bolsonaro supporters did that, because sometimes they have like a bit of backfire and they don't trust what I'm telling if it's something good about your opponent, right? And importantly, their expectation about the future also increased. So even Bolsonaro supporters become more optimistic. Does this affect their views towards democracy? In a part, in a sense, yes. Again, here I'm just showing a quick video on the inflation decrease of a few seconds. I'm not going to expect people become or fully in love of democracy or crazy against it, right? If not every time that some news about the economy is on the newspaper, you will see like riots on the street. For this reason, I capture like different degrees of democratic sentiment, and I find a significant effect on the easier one, to attend violent protests. So actually, like showing this information, making you more optimistic about the economy, makes you less likely to say that you will be willing to attend violent protests. The results on the other variables are not significant, but at least they're in the right direction. So it seems to be working. So just to conclude, I recontact people right before and after an election result to measure their expectation, belief, and attitudes. I found that this expectation shock makes extreme supporter more violent and anti-democratic. This effect seems to persist even after 1 year. And with a additional survey experiment, I managed to provide evidence that even if I cannot ensure that this is the only channel working, it for sure plays a role in making people less in favor of democracy when they lose an election. And that's all I have for today.
Thank you so much, Matteo, for that really interesting paper. So we'll move on to our second paper now. Our second paper, Election Branding and Public Trust, the Role of Image in Shaping Voter Confidence, presented by Nicklas Stein. Give Nicklas some time to pull up slides.
Hi, everyone. All right, I'm ready to go.
Floor is yours.
So hello, everybody. My name is Nicklas Stein. I'm here on behalf of the Carter Center to present our upcoming research, Who is Watching? How Election Observers Shape Trust in Democracies. A little bit about me. I graduated in 2024 from the University of Illinois with a bachelor's degree in global studies. And I began working shortly afterwards as an intern at the Carter Center's Democracy Program, where I began working on this project and am now working as a research consultant to help get it over the line. So first, a little bit about the inspiration behind this project. While working as an intern, some of my intern colleagues came across this webpage for the Honest Elections Project, which is stylized as being a nonpartisan election information group that, among other things, is interested in doing election observation and promoting voters' rights and whatnot. And as you can see, it's stylized, as I said, in a very nonpartisan way. But when you scratch a little bit below the surface and get into their messaging, you can see that it's derived from very partisan sources. Liberal dark money bankrolling the push for ranked choice voting. And so this got us thinking about how the branding and the presentation of election observation groups in particular is interpreted by the American public and how they will form their opinions based on what they see. So for a little bit of background on our project, declining trust is a prominent feature in American politics right now. Despite the lack of any evidence of electoral fraud, there's been election observation has been an important tool abroad internationally to bolster trust. And the Carter Center has a long history of doing that in many different countries and has now begun doing domestic missions as well with observation missions in the 2022 midterms and the 2024 presidential elections. And again, while the Carter Center and others have a long history of experience internationally, domestic observation is still in its infancy. And so there's not very much known about how voters form their opinions or contextualize messages based on of what they see, reports from election observation groups. American example has its own political climate, its citizens form its own belief through their own lenses, and we're interested in learning more about that. So that brings me into my research question, which is, how does the source of election observation affect public trust in elections? So this project meets at sort of an interesting intersection of theory and praxis for the Carter Center. We're very interested in the theoretical future of election observation in the United States, but we also are practically interested in how to best reach the American public through our messaging, and how to better frame our reports so that we can get a better give a better understanding to the people who read them. An example of that is the use of international norms language, which basically refers to keep grounding the election observation missions in international human rights, or the longstanding international practice of election observation. So we were able to build our study on the back of some really good research, including Bush and Prather 2017, which was a study on observer identity in Tunisia. And essentially the literature shows that election observation can increase trust, but is very conditional, is based on a lot of the different ways that people interpret information, partisanship, their perceived credibility of the group who's saying it, the identity of the observer group. And so that's something that, again, we're very interested in the US. And we've also seen nonpartisan observation missions in their infancy, again, have been successful in increasing trust in elections, based on a study of the Carter Center's 2022 election observation during the midterms. Motivated reasoning is another very important way that people view, it's a psychological phenomenon that people, on how people make their political opinions. In the context of election, the winners and losers gap is a very, very interesting point, where losers of an election are more likely to challenge the legitimacy of the election, or less likely to believe in electoral management bodies, or the institutions who run the election in general. And again, partisan attachment, prior beliefs are very, very important. Cues from political and social elites are another way that people formulate their political beliefs. So I suppose the headline is that people don't interpret these results from, for example, an election observation mission in a vacuum. So for hypotheses, just to save time, I'll only go through the first and the third. The nonpartisan impartiality hypothesis is that nonpartisan groups like the Carter Center election observation reports, I should say, from groups like the Carter Center will increase trust in elections among the people who read them. And then the international norms hypothesis, which is the idea that mentioning those international norms that I mentioned earlier, saying that the mission is based on the longstanding tradition of election observation, will decrease the credibility of an election observation mission, especially among right-leaning or low information voters. It's been the experience of the Carter Center, and there's also an abundance of literature suggesting that American voters may view international organizations that conduct election observation with a degree of skepticism, or feel that it's sort of they may impede American sovereignty, or invite criticism of the United States internationally. So this is just a visualization of our hypothesis. You can see the nonpartisan partiality hypothesis above zero there, an increase in trust, and the international standards below zero for a decrease. So for our survey design, we are currently waiting on approval from Emory IRB, but we plan to get started here as soon as we get that in late July and begin analyzing results right away. We have a contract with Qualtrics for a 7,000 person multi-armed randomized control study, where people will be exposed to different observation reports, all highlighting low levels of fraud in the 2024 elections. And the only variables involved in those information reports, those vignettes with election observation information, are the names of the organizations conducting the reports, and the use of that international norms language that I mentioned earlier. So these are the names that will be included in the study. We have the nonpartisan groups, the Carter Center, the Carter Baker Institute. We have partisan election observers, right? Like the Democratic Election Observation Initiative, groups that are explicitly partisan. And we have state-based election observation groups. So as part of our pre-treatment questions, respondents will be asked to indicate which state they come from. And then they'll be shown a vignette with if they fall into this treatment arm, with a observation group corresponding to that state. So for example, if they indicate Colorado, they'll be in the Colorado Election Observation Initiative, will appear at the top of the vignette that they see. So this is just a visualization of our survey flow. I know there's a lot of information here, but I'll try to go through it pretty quickly. So at the top, you can see that there's both a pure control and a placebo control. On the left, you can see the different names or the different groupings of names of organizations that will have their names on the vignette. All of the groups will be exposed to pre-treatment questions, asking for partisan identity, asking for state, as I mentioned before, and also asking their level of familiarity with the Carter Center in general. We think that it's important to ask party affiliation on the front end, just to make sure that we get an even randomization, an even split. In the very polarized political environment, we expect that attitudes towards electoral integrity will vary a lot by party. And so we want to have as equal representation as we can throughout all of our treatment arms. And then moving forward, you'll see that half of the groups in the treatment arms will receive language using international norms and half will not. And then they'll go straight through to an attention check, which will, make sure that people have read the information, and respondents who fail the attention check will be removed from the survey. And then they'll go into the post-treatment questions and a demo and a debrief. So for our control groups, we decided to use both a pure control and a placebo control. Both groups are going to receive a vignette with a positive outlook on the election. However, for the pure control, the positive outlook will be framed as only coming from public officials. So it'll be public officials say. There'll be no election observation mission conducted, which will help us isolate the impact of any mission being conducted at all. Whereas in the placebo control, there'll be an election observation mission, but it will be unnamed. It will be just generic. So that'll help us understand the impact of the identity of the group who's conducting the observation. So this is an example of a vignette as it'll appear on the survey. As you can see, circled up here at the top is the name. This is one of the variables here under that star logo. The text will just be different. So it might say Democratic Election Observation Initiative. And then below that, the text, there's just a short, again, positive outlook on the election. It's designed to look like a website as it might appear from an organization who, theoretically would conduct this kind of mission. Yeah, and it's written at a relatively simple reading level that we think that respondents will be comfortable with understanding. So this is an example of the vignette with the international norms text. It's just the two sentences below the first paragraph here. It's very straightforward to the point, but we think that will move the needle in terms of what people we are interested in seeing, how people interpret the vignette itself and all of the information. This is an example of the pure control. As you can see, the header of the website has been blurred out, but there's still the search bar at the top. It still appears as if it's come from a website, just that respondents will see it as having been hidden for the purpose of the survey. And you can see it discusses public officials who announce election certification on the 2024 election. Very short, very straightforward. The placebo control is a little bit longer and again mentions the election observation mission, but uses the same layout with the hidden header of the website. These are just some more elements of our vignette design. We use the partisan neutral color palette, obviously avoiding the very partisan colors in election context of red and blue, and using mostly purple.
Sorry,
yes.
So you have 3 minutes.
And then you can see uniform logo design and the names as they appear underneath the logos there. So for our outcome measures, we have various different measures of electoral integrity. Freedom from fraud represents the will of the people. And we used a 0 to 10 scale where respondents will indicate that we were able to lift that from the Bush and Prather study or borrow a lot of elements from that. They used the same 0 to 10 scale to measure electoral integrity in the minds of voters. And I'll just show you a question really quickly here. How much trust do you have in the results of the 2024 election? And 0 being no trust at all, 10 being a great deal of trust. Again, this is borrowed from Bush and Prather 2017's study, which and their measures of electoral integrity. How likely do you think it is the result of the 2024 election reflected the result of the American people? The same thing. Our secondary outcomes, a little bit more indirect measures of electoral integrity, willingness to accept future election results, trust in elections in home state and out of state. People tend to think that elections held within their that are more local to them are generally better run, and elections outside of their state may have issues or there may be malfeasance. This is a question, this is an example of a secondary outcome question. You can see it doesn't use the same 0 to 10 scale, just a little bit more general, very fair, somewhat unfair, very unfair. We're also interested in demographic information, specifically some political knowledge that'll help us delineate politically sophisticated voters from those who are not. Which party controls the US Senate? Which public official administrates the election in your state, Secretary of State? And the approval of the governor and Democratic and Republican parties. Again, we expect, or based on the very partisan environment we see in the United States, we think it'll be interesting to see how attitudes vary based on party. This is an example of the language that we use. We're trying to disarm a little bit of the social stigma that may come with not voting. For this question, who did you vote for in the 2024 presidential election? And then again, some party questions here. How satisfied are you with the Democratic Party, Republican Party? And generally speaking, do you see yourself as a Democrat or Republican? So our anticipated contributions are practical guidance on messaging for future observation missions. And we are also hoping to help understand how opinions on electoral integrity and trust in elections are formed in the United States in the American context, right? We want our reports, we want the understanding of our reports to be more effective. And we also want to know in general how people will in the future form their opinions. And then that's it for me. I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you, Nicklas. Yeah, we're going to have questions after all the papers have gone. So our next paper is The Disappearing Middle, How Polarization Makes Credible Elections Harder to Deliver by Sonali Campion. Sonali, feel free to pull up your slides.
Can you see my screen? There we go. Oh, sorry, it's just updating. There we go. Can you see that? Oh, you've gone mute for me. Hang on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm just turning off my video so it don't appear in your screen.
Oh, no, that's fine. No, I just couldn't hear you anymore. So I suddenly thought, okay, so today I'm discussing how political polarization is impacting the effectiveness of election management bodies. So this is a small end comparative study where I develop a framework of election management body capacity and use this to analyze the pressure that polarization is putting on EMBs and how they're responding. So in 2020, when Biden took the lead in Michigan, the day after polling day, the simmering tensions in the Deloitte ballot counting center began to spill over, with Republican groups rallying volunteers on social media to challenge absentee ballots. And a lot of the messaging they were using insinuated foul play. Democrats and non-partisan observers also descended on the center, again, concerned about the claims, but also wanting to ensure that votes were counted. There were far too many monitors and not enough security, which led to many being denied entries. Some of the right-wing monitors inside the centre proved increasingly disruptive, harassing count staff and attempting to challenge every ballot. Shortly before the result was called for Biden, there was simultaneous chants of stop the vote and count the vote outside the building. Despite no evidence of fraud, the images and unfounded rumours helped to fuel Trump's claims that the election had been stolen from him. And going into the 2024 elections 4 years later, almost 70% of Republicans still believed that the election had been stolen, despite multiple defeats of lawsuits and repeated assurances from election officials. So this vignette really shows how we see that polarized perspectives of what's going on fuel disruptive behavior of the actual election management process, as well as disinformation and ultimately deep distrust in the election results and process. So it's widely understood that EMBs are critical to realizing electoral integrity, but the management of election is becoming more complex for all kinds of reasons: environmental, the introduction of more special voting arrangements in many cases, but also the growing political pressures that are associated with the era of democratic backsliding. We've also seen an increasing number of studies demonstrate that political polarization negatively impacts elections and democratic institutions. A cross-national study by James and Garnett in 2023 also found that elections appeared to be harder to manage in highly polarized environments. However, little work beyond this has been done into how polarization impacts election management. So I ask, how does political polarization impact the effectiveness of election management bodies in democracies? And also how are election management bodies adapting to the challenges posed by political polarization? So I'm sure this audience is very familiar with what an EMB is, but they are the primary institutions that are responsible for organizing elections. Their structures do vary significantly around the world. A majority now are nominally independent from government, but others sit within government departments at national or local level. Remits vary from narrow operational responsibilities to full responsibilities for all aspects of management and regulations. But regardless of their model, they operate within wide electoral governance networks, which comprise not just the political parties and media and civil society organizations, but also the security agencies, government departments, and other partners and suppliers that are necessary to realizing an election. So EMBs are coordinating with all these actors, and they don't control them even when they have regulatory powers. And so their ability to deliver credible elections may be shaped by the actions, or are shaped by the actions of others. So to do their job well, an EMB needs de facto autonomy to get on with their jobs without interference. They also need sufficient capacity, and they need a base level of public confidence that they are doing a job that will produce results that are legitimate. And a deficit of any one of these will invariably impact the others, but also the overall effectiveness of an election management body. So turning to think about political polarization and the impact it has on elections. So contemporary definitions now talk about political polarization in its effective or pernicious forms. So pluralistic societies become much more compressed into binary groups, which see each other as rivals. And over time, if the polarization continues, the two sides will become increasingly intolerant of each other, and the interactions between them and the information bubbles that they exist in decline, and that further cements the divisions. So this has been talked about as eroding democratic norms in all kinds of ways. But when we think about elections specifically, they really stop being routine competitions that are based on policy or even fully on ideology. And they become much more zero-sum battles where one side is actually trying to vanquish the other, potentially once and for all. And this has been shown to create incentives for political actors to use undemocratic tactics, which might include hate speech, disinformation, or voter suppression. So their supporters are less likely to punish them for these kind of behaviors, whereas in a democracy, you would expect people to be basically turned off by those kind of strategies. The dehumanization of opponents associated with effective polarization also increases the likelihood of political violence. So several scholars have touched on how interventions, normally by incumbents, have served to erode ENB autonomy. So that might be constraining their powers to run an election or to change the rules that they are working according to, and that then undermines the credibility of elections, or installing partisan leadership, which then has an impact on the institution's ability to be perceived as non-partisan. However, the specific impacts of capacity have tended to be overlooked or not addressed directly, in part because ENB capacity can be quite a nebulous concept. So I've developed this framework, which draws on ideas of capacity found in elections and in the public management literature to use for my analysis. So ENB capacity is understood as a series of critical abilities which are then enabled or constrained by the availability or quality of certain inputs, which I refer to as the levers. So that's the bottom row. And importantly, this model does not assume that the ENB fully controls the levers. So other actors in the electoral management governance networks that I talked about earlier will influence those levers both positively and negatively. So for the purposes of the current discussion, these levers can be helpful to help us identify where polarization is putting pressure, undue pressure on an election management body. So to help sort of translate this, I've proposed mechanisms for each of the levers. So our resources mechanisms is basically saying political actors are motivated to employ undemocratic tactics, which then require the ENB to expend more resources to address the problems, misconceptions, or legal challenges that arise. With the staff, political actors who view election officials as biased towards their opponents might engage in harassment or intimidation. So that can contribute to ENB staff attrition and also challenges with recruiting appropriately qualified staff. Then we have the relationships, and this really speaks to the election management governance networks. And this is where partisan interventions impact who an ENB can work with within the election management governance networks and also how. And finally, on the processes, the increased scrutiny or interventions by partisan actors might disrupt ENB decision-making or the implementation of election management functions, as we saw in the example at the top of this presentation. So I've applied this framework to 4 democracies. So the US and Brazil represent examples where there is high polarization, while I selected Ghana and Australia as cases which, according to VData data, has relatively low polarization and no sudden increase according to the data. They are all democracies and they have ENBs which have a track record of autonomy. The US is a decentralized governmental ENB structures. The rest are centralized ENB models. So I was just trying to get a mix there, but it is a lot easier to study centralized models when you're asking these kind of questions. So in the US, the polarization has been intensifying for some time, but Trump's overt targeting of election officials and refusal to accept the 2020 result catalyzed a much more extreme mobilization, directly against election management bodies across the US. So that included attacks on election hardware and the systems, which necessitated significant security investments. On the staff front, the in-person and online harassment of election officials and poll workers increased sharply, and that contributed to high attrition and left many EMBs short-staffed in the run-up to 2022 and also 2024. Then on the relationships front, EMBs have had to develop relationships on an ongoing basis with law enforcement. So it used to be that you'd have partnerships around the actual election day itself, but now that is a continuous engagement to keep staff safe, to keep premises safe, all of those kind of things. And also it's required capacity building on the part of the law enforcement as well to help them understand the challenges and provide better protection. There's also been increased interagency coordination for areas like cybersecurity that an election management on its own might not be able to just not have the resources to deal with. And finally, on the processes side, the activists that mobilized around the 2020 election in particular have also disrupted ongoing day-to-day operations through things like mass challenges to voter eligibility, which duplicate the work that election officials are already doing, but takes up a lot of their time because they have to process and respond to them under the various laws across America. So in Brazil, they've had an intensification of polarization over the last 10 years. And that's been particularly fueled by social media and online content, as well as the rise of Bolsonaro as a candidate and then incumbent president. So he adopted a strategy of consistently and methodically accusing electoral officials of manipulating the vote as early as 2014, and has particularly sought to erode trust in the electronic voting machine. So in Brazil, we see that the TSE has its trust crashed between 2010 and 2018. So it dropped from over 50% to 26%, I think that is. But we see recovery in this case. And that's partly because of the responses we've seen in Brazil. So they've invested in technology, including apps, chatbots, and systems to monitor false claims so that they can basically push back on disinformation and reach voters and give them accurate information, and also media literacy campaigns. With the staff, there's been less direct attacks on staff, but they felt more vulnerable due to the rising violence that has been associated with polarization. The partnerships in the relationship section has helped to flag and debunk false claims. So there's a lot of media partnerships and things like that. But we have seen that alliances with political parties and social media companies have actually done very little to stem the flow of disinformation. So you're still firefighting, and that continues to be a challenge. And on the processes front, they've had to expand measures, for example, to demonstrate the security and reliability of the voting system, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. So some of these things, they are almost kind of necessary transparency measures. So I won't go into depth on the Australia and Ghana cases, but what's interesting in Ghana is that there is polarization, that despite the sort of measures saying that it's not impacting elections, we are seeing an impact on the Electoral Commission with more legal challenges and increasing disinformation and electoral violence. So even in some of these cases that might not appear in the data to come up as polarized, we are seeing impacts on elections. And that's even happening very slightly in cases like Australia, and the Electoral Commission is taking very proactive steps to protect against that. So in conclusion, it's clear that polarization is putting pressure on election management bodies, and we can see that it's making it harder for some EMBs to operate and pushing others, or all of them, to do more to build confidence and protect their reputation. The model is really helpful because it shows that it's not impacting everyone equally, but it helps to clarify where the impacts are, if you like, and also where EMBs are using those levers to push back. We also see that there are clear international and online dimensions. So Matteo at the top, he talked about the copycat tactics. You're seeing the images of Brazil and the US, which were remarkably similar. But we also see that social media and the behavior of the companies and sort of resistance to stemming disinformation that derives from polarization it remains a huge challenge that no EMB has managed to sort of crack yet. So the study is suggesting that EMBs need to take steps to minimize the kind of errors that get exploited by political actors who are trying to be critical of them. They also need to invest in measures to safeguard their reputations. But in a budget cutting environment that we are in, this is really difficult because elections are already expensive, and persuading governments to invest in future-proofing elections, especially when they are often the governments that are using these polarizing and undemocratic tactics, is a challenge. So obviously there are limited cases here, but there's lots of scope for further research. And that includes thinking about whether it appears that centralized EMBs have been better positioned to push back against some of the challenges of polarization. But equally, I'm looking at a sample of quite high autonomy and quite high capacity EMBs. So that might not be the case in other scenarios, and it might just be the specifics of the US versus some of the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonali, for that really interesting paper. I look forward to our discussion after when all the papers have been gone through. So our last paper is Hacking Voters' Trust in Democracy, Panel Evidence on Safeguarding Confidence and Electoral Integrity, presented by Iris Ong.
Hello, my name is Iris. I am a fourth-year undergraduate student at the Georgia Institute of Technology. I'm really thankful to be here today. Today, I will be presenting our research titled Hacking Voters' Trust in Democracy, Panel Evidence on Safeguarding Confidence and Election Integrity. And this largely deals with the relationship between technology and voters. Specifically, we are examining how the perception of cyber threats affects trust in elections, specifically in respect to the 2024 presidential election. I worked with Dr. Ryan Chandler from Georgia Tech, Olivia Liu from the Carr Center, and Dr. Anthony DeMattee from the Carr Center. Concerns surrounding the integrity of U.S. elections have been especially exacerbated in the past decade. Media and politicians alike have fueled narratives regarding rigging elections, hacking voting systems, and foreign interference. These shifts in voters' trust in the electoral process have been facilitated by the swift technological transformation of the voter experience. The integration of technology to conduct U.S. elections has fundamentally shifted how elections are administered. Especially with the Help America Vote Act of 2002, legislation has facilitated this digital development by establishing voting system standards and modernizing the election system overall. In the United States, as recently as 2000, 60% of votes were counted with mechanical lever machines and punch cards. Yet by 2020, over 95% of votes were counted using direct recording electronic voting machines or optical scanners. Overall, election administration has integrated technology in several steps of the process. It has replaced poll books, it has pervaded voter identity verification processes, and has been used in registration, voting, counting ballots, and auditing systems. In many ways, these advancements have made U.S. elections faster, more accessible, and even more secure. However, coinciding this digital development, we're witnessing a growing concern surrounding the integrity of this technological infrastructure. While digital technologies are making elections more objectively secure, they also make the process appear less trustworthy to the public. Currently, literature explains the disparities of the perception of election integrity through three key frameworks: partisan polarization, self-selection into partisan media silos, and disinformation. Partisanship has been an especially central and driving factor when addressing election integrity and is best explained by looking at the winner-loser gap. The winner-loser gap essentially says that voters who vote for the winning candidate will demonstrate more confidence in the election results. However, those who vote for the losing candidate will demonstrate less confidence. This aligns with research that has consistently shown that people are more likely to accept information that aligns with their pre-existing beliefs and dismiss evidence that contradicts them. Essentially, it's difficult to change opinions, and people are more inclined to disregard things that go against their personal narratives. And this brings us to our first hypothesis, the motivated reasoning hypothesis. We expect that electoral winners will exhibit increased trust in election integrity, whereas electoral losers will exhibit reduced trust. Although partisanship does largely explain this disparity in US elections, we want to illustrate the role exposure to cyber attacks has in this context. Exposure to even relatively benign cyber attacks triggers spikes in stress and anxiety, threat perception, anger, and even dread. This brings us to our second hypothesis, the cyber threats on electoral trust hypothesis, in which we expect that voters exposed to cyber threats will then demonstrate significantly lower trust in the integrity of elections. Essentially, we're saying that those who vote for the losing candidate, cyber threats will amplify their decline in trust. However, for those who vote for the winning candidate, we expect that cyber threats will dampen the increase in trust. While we look at partisanship and cyber threats as ways to explain the decreases in perceptions of election integrity, we also examined inoculation theory as a means of intervening against this fall in trust. Inoculation follows this sort of vaccination metaphor in which preemptively addressing misinformation can strengthen public resilience against disinformation, including threats to election infrastructure. Inoculation theory comes from psychology and has been effective in several different contexts, but has not been applied in the context of trust in elections. Research has shown that inoculation is more effective than debunking, which corrects information after being exposed to misinformation, and a more preventive approach has been seen as more versatile. And this brings us to our third and final hypothesis, the inoculation hypothesis, where we expect that inoculated voters who receive some sort of educational information about electoral safeguards will exhibit resilience to any exposure to cyber threats. Here is a visualization of our hypothesis. So we expect that for voters of the losing party, they will have a decrease in trust in elections after the results. For those exposed to cyber threats, we expect that this decrease will be exaggerated. However, participants that are inoculated will have any effects from the exposure to cyber threats mitigated. And for the voters of the winning party, we expect that they will increase their trust after the election. However, those exposed to cyber threats, we expect that this increase will be mitigated. And for those inoculated, any exposure to the cyber attack will have the effects will be mostly neutralized, following more closely with the control group. To illustrate the relationship between voters' exposure to cyber threats and their trust in elections, we conducted a multi-wave survey experiment in the United States. 2 survey waves were conducted, and we ensured a generally representative sample of US respondents based on gender, age, income, and ethnicity. The pre-election wave was conducted 2 weeks before the election, and we had 4,421 participants. The post-election wave was conducted 10 days after the election, and we had 3,355 of those same participants from wave 1 also participate in wave 2. So we had a retention rate of about 76%. In the pre-election wave, we asked participants about their overall belief in election integrity in both their state and the US overall. We also collected some general information about things like their political orientation and their media consumption habits. In the post-election wave, we again measured participants' trust in elections to specifically illustrate the difference before and after the election. We also want to examine voting behavior, so we asked questions such as, did you vote and how did you vote? Our treatment was conducted through 4 treatment groups. Each group viewed a professionally produced breaking news segment that was designed to resemble an ABC News broadcast, as seen here. Participants were randomly selected into each of these groups. Although we had 4 treatment groups, the results of the second group will be disregarded for the purposes of this presentation. But if you are interested, you can read results in our paper, which should be uploaded on the conference website. The first group is the control. They received no treatment in the pre-election wave. Then in the post-election wave, they were shown a general report on an upgrade on electricity infrastructure, unrelated to any kind of cyber attack. The second group again received no treatment in the first wave, but was shown a news clip on a cyber attack on election infrastructure. The third group, however, did receive a treatment in both the pre-election wave and the post-election wave. Like the previous group, they were shown the same news clip on an attack on election infrastructure. However, in the pre-election wave for the inoculation group, they were shown a video produced by Verified Voting, a nonpartisan organization that focuses on election technology. The video explained how risk-limiting audits work and how they serve as a measure to check the outcome of an election. As for our results, as seen in this figure, our results strongly support the motivated reasoning hypothesis. Our main dependent variable was the participants' perception of the integrity of US elections before and after the 2024 presidential election, and we had them self-rate their perceptions on a scale of 1 to 10. We began by disaggregating the results by vote choice, so we looked at Republican, Democratic, and nonpartisan votes. And as we can see here, voters who voted for the winning candidate, as seen in the red, demonstrated a significant increase in their perceptions of election integrity after the election. However, those who voted for the losing candidate demonstrated a decrease in their perceptions, as seen in the blue. In addition to partisanship, we also wanted to see the effect exposure to cyber attacks would have in this. This figure displays two graphs, one for electoral losers and one for electoral winners. Each graph contains two treatment groups, the control and the group that was shown in the news clip on the cyber attack on voting machines. For both groups, exposure to cyber threats decreased their trust in elections. For electoral losers, this decrease was magnified, but for electoral winners, the increase in trust was mitigated. This figure is similar to the one previously, but includes the inoculation group, and again, this group were the ones shown the video explaining risk-limiting audits. As you can see, both the inoculation group and the cyber attack group were shown the same news clip, but the perceived election integrity for the inoculation group closely aligns with the control group. Remarkably, a short clip explaining risk-limiting audits were enough to give the streamer group enough confidence in the electoral system that the exposure to cyber threats had a minimal effect. The rapid technological development of US elections has fueled unease among voters. Our results support this explanation for the reduction in perceived election integrity, as those exposed to cyber threats are more skeptical of the voting system. Although partisanship does play a significant role in this conversation, our results demonstrate that concerns surrounding the use of technology have a large effect in this situation. Despite the effect exposure to cyber attacks has on election integrity, this does not necessarily mean that the United States should disregard the use of technology. Instead, we should focus on restoring public confidence in the electoral system overall. As you can see with the effect inoculation had in our experiment, targeted educational interventions can mitigate harmful narratives. By equipping people with specific frameworks for elections in advance, inoculation strengthens cognitive defenses. Ultimately, it is necessary that we address this decline in attitudes in election integrity to ensure we have a strong democracy resilient against disinformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. With now all the paper has been presented, I'll hand over to our discussant, Aleena.
Hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here today and presenting on such great topics. I think all the papers were very well done. I was very impressed. And they all spoke very well to each other, tackling different parts of election integrity and what we should consider. So I can start with the Matteo paper. Overall, I think this was a great paper. It was a very timely topic and leveraged a very unique and important design, having both the pre and post data, panel data, and the experimental evidence as well. In terms of the theory, I really enjoyed reading the theory about the treatment of economic shock. I did think that there could be more discussion at the beginning of the paper of economic shocks instead of other drivers. So putting a little bit more context of I think that came through a little bit more in the presentation. of just people being rational and the utility that they have. So talking about that a little bit in the paper would be helpful. I think also being clear about how the presidential competence and expected economic shock is linked. I think that would be helpful, just walking through both readers and the audience of how those might be linked to one another. A visual kind of summarizing your expectations for the different economic shocks, I think would also be helpful, just to get an understanding of what those differences are. In terms of the Brazil context, I thought it was a really good case. I think you could explain a little bit more about why you think this is a particularly good case to examine economic shocks specifically as an explanation. I think more context on like how polarized is Brazil, which I think came through a little bit more in the presentation, in the paper, just talking a little bit more like this is how polarized Brazil is, how the different candidates vary in terms of their economic platforms, what were, salient issues or policy areas in Brazil. And then also talking a little bit whether policy expectations could also be an alternative explanations of social policy or other forms of policy. In terms of the design and everything, I thought it was really well done. The one point that I think maybe if you could talk a little bit more about, or maybe a direction for future research, it was the acceptance of violence measure. I was curious about what you might be thinking, or what respondents might be thinking when they're thinking about violence. So thinking about some of the existing literature, for example, the Westwood et al. Paper on using different items for measuring violence. So having general attitudes about violence versus specific measures of violence. I think that would be a helpful area to explore more in the future. Overall, really well done. It was very great to read. I'm very excited for you to see where you take this next. Next, I will move to the Nick presentation. So I didn't have the chance to read the paper for this one, but I thought the presentation for this was really great. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about just generally how often Americans come across information from election observation groups. How much do people know generally about these different election observation groups? Contextualizing, like, what does this look like in the United States? I think that would be a little bit more helpful to have. In terms of the design and the study itself, I thought the design was very well thought out, and I'm excited to see what the results are for that. I did have one point or one thought related to the control group on public officials. I was a little worried if people might infer partisanship if you don't explicitly mention that these are maybe nonpartisan officials. So maybe that might be one area where you could tweak a little bit of the design, because yeah, public officials might be too, I think there's a double-edged sword there. You're not specifically mentioning partisanship, but by not mentioning it, people might infer that. So maybe just saying nonpartisan officials about this might get around that a bit. I was also hoping you could talk a little bit more theoretically about the international norms piece and why you thought that might reduce trust or be different than the other treatments. Overall, I thought it was a really cool design study, so I'm excited to see this goes. Next, I have the Sonali paper. Overall, I thought this was really great. I really enjoyed reading about the framework, and I think it really highlights the different areas and pressure points where future research can also expand a lot further. I think thinking about this time that we're in of how different types of threats to elections can influence how elections are being managed by these different bodies in the world is really important. In terms of the framing of the study, I think you can draw a little bit more on the affective polarization literature, just to really hit home this idea of like, this is becoming a climate where things are becoming increasingly hostile, specifically in like the US and the Brazil contexts. I also really liked how you had the different case studies for the different countries, and I thought it was really important to highlight that despite these different contexts of polarizations, we are still seeing different effects play out for election management bodies. And I was wondering a little bit about some events that might be like catalyzing events. So there might not necessarily be a highly or intensely polarized climate, but the role that very catalyzing events or big events can play in influencing election management bodies and their ability to operate. And then whether also there could be spillover from neighboring areas or concerns related to that. I think this is just generally a really good area where I think many can take from and try to understand these different areas, and then also explore like longer term further consequences. So for example, if election management bodies are being impacted in these different areas, how do these impacts in these areas then influence voters? So is there effects on voter disenfranchisement? Is there consequences for loss of expertise, more room for error, that sort of thing? So I think this was a really great framework and does highlight many areas where people can take this for. So I was very excited to read this, and thank you all so much for presenting and for the for the presentations today and to read your papers. I think they were all really well done. So thank you all so much. I think I will open it up to questions and hand it over to you guys.